Hello everyone. In today's video, I bring you a story that will deeply challenge your beliefs and perceptions. Get ready to meet Eden Blackwell, a woman who literally crossed the line between life and death and returned with a shocking revelation about God. What she discovered will challenge everything religions have taught us, and the impact of this experience goes far beyond what you can imagine. What Eden saw on the other side changed everything, and this powerful message may transform your view of life. So, before we begin, be sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any content like this, and turn on the bell to receive all notifications. Now, get ready for an extraordinary journey that could forever change what you believe to be the truth about God and existence. My name is Eden Blackwell, and what I'm about to share with you is a story that completely changed my perception of life, death, and everything that exists between these two extremes. I was born and raised in a small town in Missouri, surrounded by the beautiful and imposing Ozark Mountains. From a young age, I was always a curious and adventurous person, with a special passion for motorcycles and the freedom they provide. Before the event that changed my life, I was an ordinary person, with ordinary worries. I worked as an accountant for a local company, spent my weekends with friends and family, and occasionally ventured out on motorcycle rides through the mountains. My faith was important to me, but I must admit, it was a faith based more on habits and traditions than on deep understanding. I fondly remember the Bible classes I attended as a child, taught by the sweet Mrs. Ruth Harper at the Good News Bible Club. Ruth was a remarkable figure, with her dark-rimmed glasses and shoulder-length white hair. She always wore dresses that seemed straight out of the 1960s, but her kindness and wisdom were timeless. It was with her that I learned about faith and unconditional love, lessons that, at the time, seemed simple but would take on new meaning years later. I was never a particularly religious or spiritual person. I believed in God, yes, but in a distant way, as many of us do. Life after death, heaven, hell, all those concepts seemed abstract and far removed from my everyday reality. I lived in the here and now, focused on my earthly goals and the small joys of life. But all of that changed on a spring afternoon, March 30th, 2008. That day, I decided to take a motorcycle ride through the Ozark Mountains. The weather was perfect, the sun shining in the blue sky, and I felt free and alive. Little did I know that this ride would take me on a journey that transcended the limits of life as I knew it. What happened that day, and in the days that followed, challenged everything I believed I knew about reality. It was an experience that took me to the limits of existence and brought me back, transformed. This is the story I want to share with you now. A story of pain and fear, yes, but also of indescribable beauty, unconditional love, and an understanding that goes beyond human words. I ask you, who are reading or listening to this now, to keep an open mind and heart. What I'm about to tell you may seem unbelievable, may challenge your own beliefs and perceptions, but I can assure you that every word I share comes from the deepest truth I have experienced. This is the story of my death and my rebirth. On that spring afternoon, I was enjoying the feeling of freedom that only a motorcycle can provide. The wind hit my face, bringing with it the fresh smell of the Ozark Mountains. The winding curves of the road were an invitation to adrenaline, and I accepted it gladly, leaning my bike into every turn. I was going about 30 miles per hour, a speed I considered safe for that stretch of road. The curve ahead was sharp, but I knew it well, or at least I thought I did. That's when the unexpected happened. A truck appeared in the opposite direction, taking up more space on the road than it should have. The driver, realizing the danger, tried to swerve abruptly. At that moment, time seemed to slow down. I saw, as if in slow motion, one of the hay bales the truck was carrying come loose and fall right in front of me. My heart raced, my muscles tensed, but there was no time to react. There was nowhere to go. The impact was brutal. I felt my bike ripped out from under me and my body was thrown through the air. In those seconds of flight, a strange calm washed over me. I knew I was about to be seriously hurt, maybe even fatally, But there was no fear, just a silent acceptance of the inevitable. My body hit the rocky ground of the ravine with tremendous force. I instinctively tried to cushion the fall with my left hand, resulting in a broken finger, the least of my concerns at that moment. I felt bones break, organs compress. The pain was indescribable, as if every cell in my body was screaming in agony. When I finally stopped rolling, I lay on my back, staring at the blue sky above. I tried to move, but my body wouldn't respond. Panic began to set in as I realized I couldn't feel anything below my neck. I was completely paralyzed. The silence that followed was deafening. There was no sound of traffic, no voices, just the faint whisper of the wind in the trees. I was alone, at the bottom of a ravine, seriously injured and unable to move. The reality of my situation began to sink in, and with it came a sense of resignation. I started to feel cold spreading through my body, and I knew I was going into shock. The metallic taste of blood in my mouth told me I was bleeding internally. My vision began to darken at the edges, and I knew I was losing consciousness. It was at that moment, confronted with my own mortality, that I made a quick prayer. It wasn't a desperate plea for salvation, but a quiet acceptance of whatever was to come next. If this was my time to go, I was at peace with it. And then something extraordinary happened. Something that would challenge everything I believed I knew about reality and forever change my understanding of life and death. As I lay there, on the brink of unconsciousness, something incredible happened. Suddenly, I felt a presence beside me. I opened my eyes with difficulty and, to my surprise, I saw an elderly woman standing there looking at me with unsettling calm. It was impossible for someone to have reached me so quickly, especially an elderly woman. Yet, there she was. The vision was so vivid, so real, that for a moment I forgot the pain and fear. The woman had white hair that gently fell to her shoulders, wore dark-rimmed glasses, and a dress that seemed straight out of the 1960s. Her eyes met mine with a depth that touched my soul. That's when I recognized her, and the shock of this realization almost surpassed the physical pain I was feeling. It was Ruth Harper, my former Bible teacher at the Good News Bible Club, the same Ruth who had taught me about faith and unconditional love when I was a child, the same Ruth who had passed away more than a decade ago. Ruth didn't say a word, but her presence spoke volumes. She radiated a peace and serenity that seemed to envelop the entire environment around us. The panic I had felt began to dissipate, replaced by a sense of safety and comfort I couldn't explain. I lay there, looking at her, unable to speak, but feeling a deep connection. It was as if Ruth was telling me, without words, that everything would be okay, that I wasn't alone, that no matter what happened next, I would be taken care of. Time seemed to have stopped. I can't say how long Ruth stayed there with me. It could have been seconds or hours, but her presence brought a palpable change. The pain, though still present, seemed less intense. The fear of death, which had consumed me before, gave way to serene acceptance. Then, as mysteriously as she had appeared, Ruth began to fade. It wasn't a sudden or dramatic exit. She simply began to become translucent, as if she were merging with the air around us. Her eyes, full of compassion and love, were the last thing I saw before she disappeared completely. At the moment Ruth left, I heard distant voices. They were men descending the ravine, coming toward me. Help was on the way, but even with rescue coming, I felt a deep sadness at Ruth's departure. Her presence had anchored me, given me strength when I needed it most. As the men approached, I closed my eyes, trying to imprint every detail of that inexplicable encounter in my memory. Ruth's apparition was the first sign that something extraordinary was happening, something beyond the normal understanding of reality. I didn't know it at the time, but this meeting with Ruth would only be the beginning of a spiritual journey that would completely change my view of the world, life, and death. It was the first step in an experience that would take me beyond the limits of what I believed possible and bring me back with a new understanding of divine love and the purpose of existence. After Ruth's mysterious appearance, Time seemed to drag on. The men who found me worked tirelessly to stabilize me, but I could sense the gravity of the situation in their tense voices and urgent movements. They called emergency services, but due to the remote location where I was, the full rescue would take hours. During that time, I drifted in and out of consciousness. The pain was overwhelming but strangely distant, as if it were happening to someone else. In my moments of lucidity, I thought of Ruth, her comforting presence, and it gave me the strength to keep fighting. The hours that followed were a blur of voices, sirens, and movement. I vaguely remember being placed on a stretcher, the rocking of the ambulance, the bright lights passing over me. Every time I opened my eyes, I saw worried faces watching me, lips moving in words I couldn't understand. Finally, after what seemed like days but was actually about 8 hours, I arrived at the hospital. The medical team acted quickly, taking me straight to the operating room. I was losing a lot of blood, my internal organs were damaged, and several bones were broken. The last thing I remember before the anesthesia took effect was the face of a doctor above me, his serious eyes staring at me from behind the surgical mask. He said something about doing everything possible to save me, and then everything went dark. What followed was an experience that defies explanation. While my body lay on the operating table, fighting for life, my consciousness seemed to have shifted elsewhere. I was no longer confined to the limits of my physical body. It was as if I were floating above the operating room, watching everything from an impossible perspective. I saw the doctors working frantically on my broken body. I could see the heart monitor, hear the rhythmic sound of my heartbeat. At one point, the monitor started beeping frantically, and I watched as my heart stopped. The doctors rushed to revive me, and I observed everything with a strange sense of detachment. It was at that moment that I realized I wasn't alone in this expanded state of consciousness. There were other presences around me, entities I couldn't see clearly but whose existence I could feel. Some of these presences were luminous, radiating indescribable peace and love. Others were darker, bringing with them a feeling of heaviness and desolation. As I watched this surreal scene, I felt a pull, as if something were drawing me away from the operating room. I hesitated, looking at my body on the table, at the doctors fighting to bring me back. Part of me wanted to return, to reclaim that physical form, to continue my life. But another part, a part that was growing stronger with each moment, was curious about what lay beyond. That's when I heard a voice. Or maybe it was more of a sensation than a voice. It told me that it wasn't my time yet, that I had more to do in the world of the living. With one last look at the operating room, I felt my consciousness being pulled back into my body. I woke up in the ICU, days later, surrounded by tubes and machines. The pain was intense, but I was alive. However, something had fundamentally changed. The visions I had during surgery weren't just dreams or drug-induced hallucinations. They persisted, even now that I was awake. I could see things that didn't make sense in the physical world. Luminous figures moving through the hospital, bringing comfort to the sick. Dark shadows that seemed to feed on the patient's suffering. It was as if a veil had been lifted, allowing me to see beyond this world. These visions haunted me. I closed my eyes, trying to push them away, but they persisted. It was as if I were constantly with one foot in each world, the physical and the spiritual. The doctors and nurses who cared for me couldn't see what I saw, and I was afraid to tell them, fearing they would think I was crazy. In the weeks that followed, as my body fought to heal, my mind was in turmoil. I alternated between moments of absolute clarity, where everything seemed to make sense, and periods of total confusion, where I questioned my own sanity. Visits from friends and family were difficult. They talked to me about everyday things, the weather, the news, plans for the future, while I struggled to focus, constantly distracted by the visions only I could see. How could I explain to them that, while we were talking, I could see beings of light moving through the room, or dark shadows gathering in the corners? Slowly, I began to accept that this new perception was part of who I had become. It wasn't something I could simply turn off or ignore. It was a gift, or perhaps a curse that had been given to me, and I needed to learn to live with it. It was during this recovery period that I had the most profound and transformative experience of all. An experience that would take me beyond the limits of life and death and forever change my understanding of the universe and our place in it. It was the middle of the night, about 2 weeks after my surgery. I had woken up from a restless sleep, disturbed by dreams I couldn't fully remember. The hospital room was quiet, except for the constant beeping of the machines monitoring my vital signs. Suddenly, I felt a change in the air around me. It was as if reality were folding, distorting. The walls of the room seemed to dissolve, and I found myself floating in an infinite void. There was no fear, only a sense of peace and anticipation. Then, in the blink of an eye, I was transported to a place of indescribable beauty. It was a heavenly realm, but not like any depiction I had ever seen in paintings or heard in religious descriptions. The colors were more vibrant than anything on earth, with shades I didn't even know existed. The air was alive with music, a celestial harmony that resonated in every fiber of my being. In the distance, I saw a large white barn. It glowed with its own light, as if it were made of pure energy. As I watched in awe, an angelic figure approached me. It wasn't an angel in the traditional sense, with wings and a harp. It was a being of pure light, whose form constantly shifted and flowed. This being didn't speak with words, but its message was clear in my mind. I was in a state of transition. I wasn't fully dead, but I wasn't fully alive either. It was a moment of choice, a point of decision in my spiritual journey. The being of light gently guided me, as if my body had no weight. Together, we floated through the heavenly realm. I saw fields of flowers singing with impossible colors, mountains that seemed to touch the stars, and rivers of pure light flowing in all directions. During this journey, I was overwhelmed by a deep understanding. The love of God, which I had always imagined as something abstract and distant, was actually the very essence of this place. It was an unconditional, infinite love that transcended any human concept of love I had ever experienced. I understood that this love wasn't limited to any specific religion or human interpretation. It was universal, encompassing all creation. I realized that the divisions we create on earth, between religions, races, nations, were illusory in the face of this greater reality. But not everything on this journey was light and beauty. The angelic being also showed me disturbing visions. I saw lost souls, wandering in a dark place. It wasn't a hell of fire and brimstone as many religions describe, but a state of deep spiritual suffering. These souls weren't being punished by a vengeful God. On the contrary, they were trapped in a prison of their own choices. They were those who, during their lives, had rejected love and light, choosing selfishness, hatred, and darkness. Their suffering came not from external punishment, but from the absence of the divine love they themselves had rejected. This vision filled me with a deep sadness, but also with compassion. I understood that even these lost souls were not beyond redemption. It was as if the entire knowledge of the universe was at my fingertips, and I could grasp the deepest mysteries of creation. But with this understanding also came the realization that it wasn't my time to stay. I had a mission to fulfill back on Earth, a message to share. I was back in my body in the hospital room, the beeping of the machines reminding me that I was still in the world of the living. I opened my eyes, tears streaming down my face. I knew that I had experienced something beyond ordinary human comprehension, something that would forever change my view of life, death, and everything that exists between those two extremes. I woke up in the hospital room with a profound sense of disorientation. The contrast between the heavenly realm I had experienced and the mundane reality of the hospital was shocking. The sterile white walls, the smell of disinfectant, the monotonous sound of the machines. It all seemed surreal and somewhat oppressive after the transcendent beauty I had witnessed. In the days that followed, I struggled to process everything that had happened. The experience was etched in my memory with crystal clear clarity, every detail as vivid as the moment it occurred. But how to explain something like this? How to put into words an experience that transcended human language? The doctors and nurses noticed a change in me. My attitude toward recovery had transformed. Where there was once fear and uncertainty, there was now a serene determination. I knew that I had a purpose to fulfill, a reason for coming back, and that gave me the strength to face the challenges of rehabilitation. My family and friends also noticed the change. They commented on a different light in my eyes, a peace that seemed to emanate from me even in the most difficult moments. I wanted to share with them what I had experienced, but the words seemed inadequate. How to describe colors that don't exist on Earth? How to explain a love so vast that it encompasses all creation? The physical recovery was long and painful. I had to relearn how to perform the most basic tasks. Every movement was a challenge, every step a victory. But the physical pain seemed insignificant compared to the internal transformation I was experiencing. The visions that began after my first surgery continued. I still saw beings of light and dark shadows moving through the hospital. But now, instead of frightening me, these visions constantly reminded me of the greater reality I had experienced. I began to see these entities as part of a spiritual world that coexisted with our physical world, two sides of the same coin of existence. During my recovery, I spent a lot of time reflecting on what I had learned in my journey beyond life, the understanding I gained about God's unconditional love, about the interconnectedness of all things, about the true purpose of existence. All of this continued to unfold in my mind, revealing new layers of meaning every day. One of the most profound realizations was about the nature of time. In my experience beyond life, time as we know it didn't exist. Past, present, and future seemed to coexist in an eternal now. This realization completely changed my relationship with time in everyday life. I learned to live more in the present moment, to value each instant as a precious opportunity for growth and expression of divine love. Another significant change was my attitude toward death. The fear of death, which is so common in our society, had completely disappeared. I knew, with a certainty that went beyond blind faith, that death was not the end, but rather a transition to something much greater and more beautiful. This understanding gave me incredible freedom to live fully, without the constant weight of fearing mortality. As my physical recovery progressed, I began to feel a growing urgency to share my experience. I knew that what I had gone through wasn't just for me, but a message that needed to be shared with the world. However, I was also aware of the challenges I would face in trying to communicate something so profound and ineffable. Finally, after months of recovery, I was discharged from the hospital. Returning home was a bittersweet experience. On one hand, I was happy to leave behind the clinical and sterile environment of the hospital. On the other hand, leaving that space where I had experienced such a profound transformation made me feel as if I were closing an important chapter of my life. But I knew it wasn't the end of the journey. In fact, it was just the beginning. As I crossed the threshold of my home, I carried with me not only the physical scars of the accident, but also a wisdom and a mission that would change my life. In the months following my return home, I went through an intense process of integration and assimilation. The near-death experience had given me profound insights into the nature of reality, and now I faced the challenge of incorporating this new understanding into my daily life. One of the most significant changes was in my view of religion and spirituality. Before the accident, I had a fairly conventional relationship with faith. I regularly attended church, followed the rituals and traditions without questioning much. But now, everything seemed different. Organized religions, which had once provided me with a certain comfort, now seemed limited, as if they were only partial glimpses of a much greater truth. I understood that God, or the divine source, wasn't confined to human dogmas or rituals. The true essence of the divine was unconditional love, something that was often obscured by the rules and fears propagated by some religious institutions. This realization was both liberating and challenging. On one hand, I felt a deeper and more direct connection to the divine, without the need for intermediaries or rigid rules. On the other hand, I found myself distanced from the familiar structures that had once defined my spiritual life. Friends and family who shared my old faith had difficulty understanding my new perspective, and this sometimes led to conflicts and misunderstandings. Another profound change was in my understanding of the nature of reality. The experience beyond life had shown me that the physical world we perceive with our senses is only a small part of a much vaster and more complex reality. I began to see the world around me in a completely new way. Everyday objects, a table, a tree, even my own body, now seemed to vibrate with an energy I had never noticed before. I understood that everything was interconnected on a deep level, part of a cosmic fabric of energy and consciousness. This realization completely transformed my relationship with the natural world and with other people. My understanding of the purpose of life also changed radically. Before, I lived in pursuit of material success, social recognition, and personal achievement. Now, I understood that the true purpose of existence was much simpler, and at the same time much deeper, to live with love, compassion, and empathy. I realized that every interaction, every moment, was an opportunity to express that divine love I had experienced in my journey beyond life. A smile for a stranger, an act of kindness for a neighbor, even a compassionate thought. All of these took on new meaning and importance. The understanding of the cyclical nature of life and death also brought a new perspective to my relationships. I began to see each person as an eternal soul on a journey of learning and evolution. This helped me to be more patient and understanding, even in difficult or conflicting situations. However, this new understanding also brought challenges. Sometimes I felt alienated from the world around me, as if I were living between two realities. The concerns and ambitions that motivated many people now seemed trivial in light of what I had experienced. I had to learn to navigate this new territory, to find a balance between my new spiritual perception and the demands of everyday life. Another significant change was in my relationship with time and death. The experience beyond life showed me that time, as we perceive it here, is an illusion. In the spiritual reality I experienced, past, present, and future seemed to coexist in an eternal now. This understanding radically changed my perception of time in everyday life. I began to live much more in the present moment. Speaking of death, my fear of it had completely vanished. Before the accident, like many people, I had a latent fear of death, an anxiety about the unknown that awaits us at the end of life. Now, I knew, not as a belief, but as a direct experience, that death is not the end. Each experience an opportunity for growth and the expression of the divine love I had experienced. However, this new understanding also brought challenges in my personal relationships. Friends and family often had difficulty understanding the changes I was going through. My new perspective on life and death sometimes clashed with the beliefs and values of those around me. I had to learn to navigate these delicate waters, to express my new understandings in a way that didn't alienate the people I loved. It was a constant learning process that required patience, compassion, and a good deal of humility. Another significant change was in my relationship with the natural world. After my experience, I began to perceive a deep connection with all of nature. Every tree, every animal, every drop of rain seemed to vibrate with a divine energy that I had never noticed before. I understood that everything is part of an intricate web of life and consciousness, and that our actions have repercussions far beyond what we can imagine. This realization led me to adopt a more conscious and sustainable lifestyle. I began to question my consumption habits, my diet, my relationship with natural resources. I felt a greater responsibility to care for the planet and all the beings that inhabit it. Perhaps the deepest change was in my understanding of love. The love I experienced during my journey beyond life was something far beyond what we call love here on Earth. It was an unconditional, universal love that encompassed all creation. I understood that this love is the true essence of the divine, the force that moves the universe. This understanding transformed all of my relationships. I began to see each person as a unique manifestation of this divine love, regardless of their actions or beliefs. And the injustices of the world threaten to obscure this greater truth that I experienced. In those moments, I have to consciously strive to reconnect with that experience of universal love. Despite the challenges, I feel a deep gratitude for having had this transformative experience. It gave me a new perspective on life, death, and the purpose of existence. I understood that we are all on a journey of spiritual growth and evolution, and that every experience, even the painful ones, is an opportunity for learning and expansion. As I continued to integrate these new understandings into my daily life, I felt a growing desire to share what I had learned. Not to convert or convince anyone, but to offer a different perspective, a vision of hope and love that might bring comfort and inspiration to others. I knew that the path ahead wouldn't be easy. Talking about near-death experiences and spiritual realities isn't always well received in our materialistic society, but I felt that I had a responsibility, a calling, to share this message of love, compassion, and interconnectedness with the world. And so, with a mixture of apprehension and excitement, I began to take the first steps toward sharing my story. I didn't know exactly how it would unfold, but I trusted that the same divine love that had guided me through death and back to life would continue to guide me in this new phase of my journey. After months of processing my experience and integrating my new understandings into everyday life, I felt ready to start sharing my story with the world. However, I quickly realized that this task would be much more challenging than I had imagined. The first obstacle I faced was the difficulty of translating my experience into words. How do you describe colors that don't exist in our visible spectrum? How do you explain sensations that transcend our five senses? Human language, so well suited to describing our physical reality, seemed terribly inadequate for expressing the spiritual realities I had experienced. Despite this, I began to write. I spent hours in front of the computer, struggling to find the right words, the most appropriate metaphors to convey what I had experienced. Often, I felt frustrated by the inadequacy of my descriptions, but I persisted, guided by the certainty that this message needed to be shared. When I finally gathered the courage to show my writings to friends and family, the reactions were mixed. Some were fascinated, deeply moved by my story. Others seemed skeptical, questioning whether my experience had been just a vivid dream or a hallucination caused by the proximity to death. These skeptical reactions were difficult to deal with at first. Part of me desperately wanted everyone to believe, for everyone to see what I had seen. But over time, I realized that it wasn't my role to convince anyone. My responsibility was simply to share my experience honestly and let each person draw their own conclusions. Encouraged by the positive response from some friends, I decided to broaden my reach. I started attending support groups for people who had gone through near-death experiences. In these meetings, for the first time, I felt truly understood. Being among people who had gone through similar experiences was incredibly comforting and validating. In these groups, I also had the opportunity to hear other stories of near-death experiences. I was struck by the similarities between many accounts, despite the cultural and religious differences of the people involved. This reinforced my conviction that there was a universal truth behind these experiences, something that transcended our individual interpretations and beliefs. Over time, I gained the confidence to speak publicly about my experience. I began giving talks at small local events, libraries, community centers, church groups. At first, I was extremely nervous before each presentation. I feared being ridiculed or discredited, but as I continued to share my story, I discovered that there was a genuine hunger for this kind of spiritual experience. People would come up to me after the talks, often with tears in their eyes, to share their own stories of encounters with the divine. Some had never spoken about these experiences before, fearing they would be considered crazy. I realized that by sharing my story openly, I was creating a safe space for others to do the same. However, not all reactions were positive. I faced criticism from skeptics who dismissed my experience as the delusions of a dying brain. Some religious leaders accused me of promoting heresies, arguing that my experience didn't align with their specific doctrines. These criticisms were painful, but helped me develop thicker skin and strengthen my conviction in the truth of my experience. As my story spread, I began receiving invitations to speak at larger events and give interviews to the local media. This brought new challenges. How do you condense such a profound and complex experience into a 5-minute interview? How do you deal with skeptical or hostile interviewers? I learned to be succinct without compromising the essence of my message and to stay calm in the face of challenging questions. One of the most rewarding parts of sharing my story was seeing the impact it had on people. I received countless messages from individuals saying that my account had changed their perspective on life and death, brought comfort in times of grief, or reignited their spiritual faith. However, I also had to deal with unrealistic expectations. Some people saw me as a sort of spiritual guru, expecting me to have all the answers to life's mysteries. I had to learn to set healthy boundaries, constantly reminding both others and myself that I was just an ordinary person who had had an extraordinary experience. Throughout this process of sharing my story, my own understanding continued to evolve. Each time I recounted my experience, every question I answered made me reflect more deeply on what I had lived through. I realized that the act of sharing wasn't just for the benefit of others, but also an important part of my own healing and integration process. Over time, I began writing a book about my experience. The writing process was therapeutic and enlightening. It forced me to examine every aspect of my journey in detail, to search for words to describe the indescribable. The book became not just a recounting of my near-death experience, but a reflection on how that experience had transformed my life and worldview. As I continued to share my story, I realized I was doing more than simply recounting a personal experience. I was offering a message of hope in a world often dominated by fear and despair. I was reminding people of their spiritual nature in an increasingly materialistic society. And above all, I was sharing a message of unconditional love in a world that desperately needs it. This journey of sharing my experience wasn't easy. There were moments of doubt, fear, and exhaustion. But every time I saw the spark of recognition in someone's eyes, every time I received a message from someone whose life had been touched by my story, I knew I was on the right path. It wasn't just my story being told, but a greater truth about our spiritual nature and the infinite love that awaits us beyond this life. As my story spread, I began to notice a broader impact on the society around me. What started as a deeply transformative personal experience was now touching the lives of countless others, sparking discussions and in some cases, significant changes. One area where I noticed considerable impact was in the field of medicine. Doctors and nurses who heard my story began to approach their terminal patients in a different way. They became more open to discussing their patients' spiritual experiences and more sensitive to the emotional and spiritual needs of those facing death. At a local hospital, I was invited to speak to the medical staff about my experience. After my talk, several healthcare professionals shared that they had witnessed unexplainable phenomena with patients near death, but had never felt comfortable discussing those experiences openly. My story had opened a space for these important conversations. In the field of scientific research, my account, along with others like it, motivated some scientists to investigate near-death experiences more deeply. While many in the scientific community remained skeptical, some researchers began to seriously consider the possibility that consciousness could exist independently of the physical brain. I was invited to participate in a study at a nearby university, where researchers were investigating the similarities and differences among various near-death experiences. This study not only validated many aspects of my experience but also contributed to a broader understanding of these phenomena. In the religious realm, my story sparked both interest and controversy. Some religious communities welcomed me with open arms, seeing my experience as a confirmation of their beliefs about the afterlife. Others reacted with skepticism or even hostility, arguing that my experience didn't align with their specific doctrines. These mixed reactions led to fascinating discussions about the nature of spirituality and religion. In several cases, I was invited to participate in interfaith panels where representatives of different faith traditions discussed their perspectives on the afterlife. These conversations often led to deeper understanding and mutual respect between the different traditions. In the educational sphere, my story began to be used as a starting point for discussions about ethics, philosophy, and spirituality. I was invited to speak at several schools and universities, where students showed surprising interest in my experience. Many young people, disillusioned with the materialism of modern society, found in my story an alternative perspective that resonated with their own spiritual longings. At a state university, a philosophy professor began using my book as part of the curriculum for a course on consciousness and reality. Students were encouraged to critically analyze my experience, considering its philosophical and ethical implications. I was deeply touched to learn that my story was inspiring young minds to question and explore the great questions of existence. In the field of psychology and counseling, my experience offered a new perspective on dealing with the fear of death and grief. Therapists and counselors began incorporating elements of my story into their work with patients who were struggling with death-related anxiety or coping with the loss of loved ones. I was invited to speak at a retreat for mental health professionals, where I shared how my experience had transformed my relationship with death. Many participants reported that this new perspective had helped them approach the topic of death with their patients in a more positive and hopeful way. In the media, my story gained considerable attention. I was interviewed by local and national newspapers, participated in radio programs, and even appeared in a few television documentaries about near-death experiences. Although I sometimes felt uncomfortable with all this attention, I recognized that it was an important opportunity to bring my message to a wider audience. One of the most surprising impacts was in the field of palliative care. Professionals working with terminally ill patients began using my story as a tool to offer comfort and hope. In several hospices, my book became recommended reading for both patients and their families. I was deeply moved when I received a letter from a hospice nurse describing how my story had helped a young patient face her final days with peace and acceptance. Knowing that my experience was bringing comfort to people in their final moments made me feel that all the challenges of sharing my story were worth it. However, not all the impact was positive. My story also attracted criticism and controversy. Hardcore skeptics argued that I was promoting superstition and magical thinking. Some even suggested that I was exploiting vulnerable people for personal gain. These criticisms were painful, but they forced me to examine my own motivations and be even more careful and ethical in how I shared my experience. I learned to accept that not everyone would be open to my message, and that was okay. My role wasn't to convince anyone, but simply to offer my perspective to those who were open to it. One of the most interesting developments was the emergence of a community around my story and other similar experiences. People from across the country, and even from other parts of the world, began to connect, sharing their own experiences and supporting one another. This growing community led to the organization of conferences and events dedicated to exploring near-death experiences and their implications. I participated in several of these events as a speaker, but the most rewarding part was the opportunity to meet others who had gone through similar experiences. There was a sense of camaraderie and mutual understanding that was deeply comforting. As the impact of my story continued to expand, I began to realize that it had become something larger than myself. It was no longer just about my personal experience, but about a broader shift in how our society views life, death, and the nature of consciousness. People were beginning to question old paradigms and consider possibilities they would have previously dismissed. Conversations about spirituality and the meaning of life were happening in places where they had once been taboo. And, perhaps most importantly, there was a growing movement toward a more compassionate and interconnected worldview. Of course, it would be naive to think that my story alone was responsible for all these changes. I was just one voice among many, part of a larger movement toward a more holistic understanding of reality. But it was gratifying to know that my experience was contributing, even in a modest way, to this transformation. As I reflected on the impact my story had had, I felt deeply humbled and grateful. What had begun as a personal tragedy, a near-fatal accident, had turned into a force for positive change in the world. It was a powerful reminder of how the universe can use even our most difficult experiences for a greater purpose. Looking to the future, I felt both hopeful and a little apprehensive. I knew there was still much work to be done, many people to reach, and many minds and hearts to touch. But I also knew that I wasn't alone on this journey. There was an entire community of people working to bring more light and understanding to the world. And so, with a renewed sense of purpose and determination, I prepared for the next chapter of this incredible journey. I didn't know exactly what the future held, but I was certain of one thing. The message of love, compassion, and interconnectedness that I experienced in my journey beyond life would continue to spread, touching lives and transforming hearts, one at a time. As I come to the end of this narrative, I feel a mixture of emotions: gratitude, awe, humility, and a deep sense of purpose. Looking back on that spring afternoon that changed everything, I am amazed by the journey that has unfolded since then. The motorcycle accident that nearly took my life paradoxically became the gateway to a richer and more meaningful existence. The near-death experience I had was not just a glimpse of something beyond this life, but a call to live this life with more depth, love, and awareness. Reflecting on everything that has happened since that fateful day, I realize that every challenge, every moment of doubt or fear, every criticism faced, served a greater purpose. Those difficulties forced me to examine my beliefs more deeply, to articulate my experience with greater clarity, and to live according to the truths I discovered in a more authentic way. One of the most important lessons I've learned along this journey is the infinite nature of love. The love I experienced during my near-death experience, an unconditional, universal, and all-encompassing love, continues to be the driving force behind everything I do. I've learned that this love is not something to be sought externally, but a reality to be recognized and expressed in every moment of our lives. Another profound understanding that continues to shape my life is the interconnectedness of all things. The vision of a universe where everything and everyone is intrinsically linked has fundamentally changed the way I relate to the world around me. Every interaction, every choice, every thought takes on new meaning in light of this understanding. The transformation of my relationship with death has also been one of the most significant changes in my life. The fear of death, which once loomed like a shadow over many of my decisions and experiences, has been replaced by a serene acceptance and even curiosity about this great transition. This release from the fear of death has allowed me to live more fully, embracing each moment with renewed appreciation. Sharing my story with the world has brought its own challenges and rewards. There were times when I felt exposed and vulnerable, moments when I doubted whether I was doing the right thing by speaking so openly about such a personal and profound experience. But every time I received a message from someone whose life had been touched by my story, every time I saw a spark of recognition or hope in a listener's eyes, I knew I was on the right path. One of the most rewarding surprises of this journey has been the community that has formed around this shared experience. Meeting others who have gone through near-death experiences, hearing their stories, sharing insights and mutual support, has been incredibly enriching. This community constantly reminds me that I am not alone on this journey and that there is a greater purpose at play. At the same time, I am deeply aware that my experience, as transformative as it has been for me, is only a small part of a much larger mystery. I don't have all the answers, and the more I learn, the more I realize how much there is still to discover. This awareness keeps me humble and open, always seeking to learn and grow. Looking to the future, I feel both excitement and reverence for the path ahead. I know there is still much work to be done, many people to reach, many minds and hearts to touch. The message of love, compassion, and interconnectedness that I received during my near-death experience is more relevant than ever in our often divided and fearful world. My hope is that by continuing to share my story and living the truths I discovered, I can contribute, even in a modest way, to a positive shift in our world, a shift toward a greater understanding of our spiritual nature, a deeper appreciation for the preciousness of life, and a recognition of love as the fundamental force that unites all of existence. As I conclude this narrative, I want to express my deepest gratitude. Gratitude for the life that was returned to me on that fateful day. Gratitude for the extraordinary experience I was granted. Gratitude for every person who has listened to my story with an open mind and heart. And gratitude for the infinite love that I discovered to be the true essence of our existence. To those who are reading or listening to this story, my final message is simple. The love I experienced beyond this life is available to all of us, here and now. You don't need to have a near-death experience to access it. It is present in every act of kindness, in every moment of genuine connection, in every expression of compassion. My journey continues, as does that of all of us. May we all walk with open hearts, ready to recognize the divine love that permeates all of existence, and may we live each day with the awareness that we are all part of something much greater and more beautiful than we can imagine. As we move forward, I remind myself and all of you, death is not the end but a new beginning. And life, this precious life we are living now, is an incredible opportunity to grow, love, and evolve. Let us embrace it with all the courage, compassion, and joy we can gather. And so, with gratitude in my heart and hope in my spirit, I continue my journey, always open to the wonders and mysteries the universe has to offer. Thank you for sharing this journey with me. May it, in some way, illuminate and enrich your own unique and precious journeys. If you enjoyed this beautiful spiritual testimony, leave a like, comment with your thoughts, subscribe to the channel, and don't forget to hit the notification bell to watch every new video and help us spread this message to more people. See you next time.